Hello and welcome to a special Just for Kids edition of Building Blocks, where we're asking on Wednesday evenings, what is grace? And we're looking at faces of grace. Did you bring your Bible? This is Bible class. I invite you to open your Bible with me to 1 Samuel chapter 20. You may not open your Bible there as often as to the Gospel of Matthew or the book of Acts in the New Testament, but it's pretty easy to find. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, and we're going to be in chapter 20 here in just a few minutes. What is grace? That's what we're exploring this month, and we're learning that grace is undeserved blessing. Okay, but what does that mean? What does it look like in real life? On Wednesdays this month, we're looking at what we've called faces of grace, examples of real people in the Bible who gave and received grace. This week we're looking at David, you've heard of him before, and Mephibosheth. You ever heard that name before? Can you imagine if your parents had named you Mephibosheth, having to write that on a school paper when it asks for your name? That was this man's name. And he received great grace from David that we're going to read about in just a moment. But before we get there, when David was much younger, he wasn't the king. There was another king in Israel, King Saul. And Saul hated David because he was very jealous of David. But even though Saul was really mean, David was always kind. He was respectful to King Saul. In fact, David's best friend was Saul's son, Jonathan. And David made two promises. One to his best friend, Jonathan, in 1 Samuel chapter 20. Is your Bible open there? Listen to Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20 and verse 14 as he says to David, "If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord that I may not die, and do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever." Jonathan doesn't know how long he's going to live, but he's saying, even if I die, David, don't forget to show my house, my descendants, my family kindness. David made a promise to Jonathan to do just that. But a few pages later, if you turn to 1 Samuel 24, David also made a promise to King Saul. Even though Saul was so hateful and mean to David, in 1 Samuel 24 and verse 20, listen to Saul. As he says to David, "Now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. Eventually, you might have learned in a different Bible class that the Philistines, a nation right beside the Israelites, they attack King Saul and his sons and all of the soldiers in Israel, and King Saul and David's best friend Jonathan, they die in battle. Let's go to the next book of the Bible, to 2 Samuel chapter 9, where years later, David is a much older man now, and he's got a question. In 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 1, he asks, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Let's keep reading together and notice a few really important points. Verse 2 tells us, "Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David, and the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'I am your servant.' And the king said, 'Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?' Ziba said to the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet.'" In fact, a few pages before this, in 2 Samuel 4 and verse 4, we find out how this son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul, came to be crippled. When he was just 5 years old, when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, this great battle where his father and his grandfather died, Mephibosheth's nurse took him up and fled, and as she fled in her haste, he fell. And he became lame. He was paralyzed. And ever since he was 5 years old, Mephibosheth had been crippled in his feet. Now David is hearing about him for the very first time. In verse 4, the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba, this servant, tells him exactly where to find Mephibosheth. And so they send for him and they bring him before David. In 2 Samuel 9 in verse 6, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. Mephibosheth is afraid of what David is going to do to him because of who his grandfather was and how mean King Saul had been to David. David says, "Mephibosheth," and he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness." Even though this man's grandfather was so hateful to David, he hunted him like an animal, trying to kill him. David says, "I'm going to show you, his grandson, kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." Think about that. Even though Mephibosheth has nothing, he deserves nothing from David, he could repay nothing to David, David gives him all that belongs, all that had belonged to his grandfather Saul. In verse 9, the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house, I have given to your master's grandson." But he does even more than that. He basically adopts Mephibosheth into his own family. Look at verse 10. "You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Last verse of the chapter, verse 13. "So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet." Here was a man who could do very little to take care of himself, and he was absolutely terrified when the next king calls him before the throne. Mephibosheth has nothing. He deserves nothing from David. Whatever he gets, he certainly can't repay. And David gives him everything that his grandfather, the former king, had enjoyed, and says, even you, even though your grandfather treated me cruelly, I want you to sit at my table with my sons for the rest of your life. What is that? That is grace. Undeserved blessing. Now, your in-class teacher has a variety of things to think through with you. What can we learn from this in the 21st century? How ought this to shape the way we treat others? There's more Bible class to come, but I appreciate you thinking through these faces of grace with me. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you real soon.